Hello again. We're raising questions again, probably two or three, and we have them right here, so we'll get going. The first one is, of all things, what does the Garden of Eden have to do with the Republican health care bill, the one that's inching its way through the Senate as we speak, and which is going to be very, very important when it finally gets out of the Senate or if it dies in the Senate. But anyway, what does the Garden of Eden have to do with that? And then we're going to move on also to the legend of the sacred pole, the legend of the sacred pole. And we are going to inch towards the topic of what's wrong with the country? Why is it falling apart? And how are we going to get out of the crisis that I think that we're in? So once again, let's go with the question, what does the Garden of Eden have to do with all of this? We'll answer that at the exciting conclusion of the show. The first thing to say is that a Republican leader in the Congress was shot a couple of weeks ago. We all know about that, and that indicates, in a really hyper-focused way, that the country is fraying, at least fraying, maybe even falling apart, I don't know. And that in turn is leading to a lot of other problems, some of which aren't really all that clear. So let's go right away to the legend of the sacred pole. According to this myth, there was a tribe in Australia that had a sacred pole. It carried that pole everywhere it went. The tribe wandered around a lot. And every night it would set up the pole, sort of like a tent pole without a tent. And in the morning, the pole would have fallen over a little bit, and the direction in which the pole was pointing indicated the direction that the tribe would have to go that day, and it always worked. And then one day, the pole broke. Not good, not good at all. This led to a lack of direction, it led to anxiety and depression, and the tribe really suffered. So obviously that's an allegory of some sort, a story that shows us something about life. And the question that gives us is, does the United States at the moment have a sacred pole, so to speak? Something that we carry around and that's in the center of our community as a nation and that points us in the right direction. And a lot of people are saying, well, we used to have that. The churches used to be a lot like that pole. They would point us in the right direction, as well as the federal government. Not just those two, but they were really big institutions, and they still are big institutions, but they don't carry quite the authority that they used to have. And this is leading to some really interesting effects. We do have moral authority in the country, not the churches and government so much anymore, as astounding things like Hollywood actors and the whole concept, the whole billowing concept of Hollywood itself, not just the people in it, but Hollywood itself. People look to Hollywood, to actors, to tell them how to vote, how to think, how to live. The actors do provide some sort of moral guidance, often in a non-moral way, but for a while now, Americans have been looking at those people in Hollywood and other prominent celebrities for answers to life, of all things. How about also, besides actors, the internet? That's quite clearly one of the big sources of the authority that the sacred pole used to have for that Australian tribe. Facebook, for instance. People say, well, if it's on Facebook and a friend of mine posted it, it must be true. That's not necessarily true, of course. And there are a lot of other criticisms that you can make of the internet. It's a fabulous invention, but it doesn't provide what some of its inventors may have intended it to do, It doesn't provide a clear direction for people. Well, what are the causes of that lack of a sacred pole? What happened? Why did we lose our sacred pole? What are the factors that led to the end, in some respects, of a moral authority? That's the question, in other words, that most Americans could look to. What caused this weakening of moral authority overall? Well, for one thing, as we talked about before, the Constitution. The American Constitution is the oldest in the world. It works well in a lot of ways, but it features a separation of powers. And that's almost automatically a message to the people that there are at least three different sources of moral authority. The Congress, and if you break that in half, the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, and the Supreme Court and the President. So we have 3 or even 4 sources of moral authority. It's very hard to switch on the television and learn what the government as a whole is telling us would be the right thing to do. And we don't have a king or queen to make up for that. Other countries do. Another thing, another reason why we've had the snapping of that poll that we're talking about is that the government itself has misbehaved. Ever since Watergate, we know that. Ever since the lies about Vietnam and other kinds of bad behavior in the White House, it's pretty clear that the government itself is not behaving in a way, always, that provides backbone for the idea that it is a source of moral authority. Another thing is that in our history, we are actually built up of several nations. People came here from all sorts of places. And just as an example of that, in the Northeast, people came here with something of a Puritan background, many of them, and they decided a great way to run villages, towns, cities, etc., was to have everybody vote on a lot of issues. Everybody gets to vote. That was something of a moral authority, in other words. Moral authority lay in the people. Also, educated people were given a nod here in New England, in the Northeast, by the Puritans. And in other parts of the country, that wasn't true. In some parts of the South, for instance, the idea was not that everybody gets to vote, certainly not blacks, and not even whites at the lower end of the economic scale, or even the middle class. The people who got to vote, if there was a vote at all, were the gentry who came over here from places like England and set up vast estates that were just like serf estates back home. They were called plantations. And the upshot of all that is that in the States, in other words, we have differing ideas, rock bottom ideas that are at least 200 years old. What is the moral authority for government? Is it in the people, as the Puritans might say? And also, the question is it in a non-elected gentry, which plantation owners in the South would say? And this is reflected in the Constitution too. So at the moment, what we have is several regions in America founded on several nations with competing ideas on absolute basics about how to run the country and who's right, who's wrong, who has the final moral authority. In fact, we can see that now to some extent with the Democrats in Congress fighting the White House. That's an illustration of this very, very, very basic dissension in the country. And again, this has led to a lot of interesting problems. The old order has collapsed, basically. It used to be that we had some sense as a nation that the federal government could speak with moral authority. But for the reasons that I've just talked about, it lacks that authority now, or at least it lacks an awful lot of it. So the old order has collapsed. People lack a sense of belonging to one nation, and they lack a sense of listening to one source of moral authority. So let's make this more interesting. What does that lead to? Well, in the first place, the opioid crisis that we have now, the drug problem that we have now that people are talking about. And people are calling it a medical problem, whereas actually many people, and I agree with them, think it's not so much a medical problem. Partly it is, of course, but mostly it's a social problem. And it centers on the fact that a lot of people feel cut out of the mainstream. They feel that they've dropped off the cliff, they don't belong to the country anymore, and that goes back again to that moral authority that I'm talking about. A moral authority might be able to make more people feel like they are more of the country by regulating business, corporations, and other private interests and bringing them into the fold, bringing them into one coherent set of moral principles by which to guide the nation. I think that's behind a lot of the drug problem, that people don't feel like they really belong to society. And you can point a lot of fingers there. So what does this have to do with the Republican health care bill? The Republican health care bill is a monstrosity. I think a lot of people realize that. and it ought to be opposed, at least in my opinion. The central question behind the Republican or the Democratic conception of how to give America the health care that it needs, the central question is, are we responsible for each other, and should everybody contribute to just about everything that the government does or that society does? For instance, if you have children, you might be happy to pay the taxes that go to schools. If you have no children, well, you could make a case that you shouldn't pay taxes that go to schools. You should be excluded from those. If you oppose a certain war, let's say, then you should have the right, a person could say, not to pay the share of taxes that goes to the Pentagon. You can make cases like that, but we don't do that. We don't do that, except when it comes to medical care. And for some reason, that's open territory. And we hear all sorts of silliness. For instance, people say that they're young, they don't need medical care, therefore they don't need medical insurance, so they ought to be able to either not buy it at all or to buy a kind of slimmed down medical insurance that's very cheap. Well, there are a couple of things wrong with that. The first thing that's wrong with it is you never know when the 18-wheeler is going to hit your car. That's number one. And number two, let's go back to the streets and the schools. The point is that every individual lives in and is a part of the country. And every individual, therefore, ought to contribute to things that, even though in particular they might not use, like a street or a school, because that makes the whole country stronger. And if we're all healthy, then probably the country is stronger, and every individual in some way is going to be stronger too. So the question behind, again, the Republicans and the Democrats and their different slants on medical care, the question comes down to, are we responsible for each other, and should everybody be compelled to buy health insurance? Again, I side with the people who say yes. In Germany and in other places, that's not even a question. It's just taken for granted. The people who are young and healthy today will be older and perhaps more frail tomorrow, and then they are going to say to the youth alive later on, everybody should pay, and that's the basic principle. So what's that got to do with the Garden of Eden? Well, we all know that Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, but it did them some good. They were kicked out because they had become conscious. They'd become knowledgeable. They were kicked out because they could fend for themselves later on. Well, of course, they had a couple of boys. One slew the other, one murdered the other, and he looked up to heaven, I guess, and said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" when he was accused of doing the wrong thing. Well, the answer is yes. We ought to take that into some consideration. Everybody in our society has to help take care of everybody else, or else the country will fray and fray and fray. We're going to get weaker and weaker, lose our moral authority in the rest of the world, and maybe we'll all suffer from that. So what's the upshot of all this? The Garden of Eden story and Cain and Abel and so forth? It might be a good idea for everybody to step back and say, what's the unselfish thing to do, and how can I contribute to the welfare of the country?